You're listening to the Asia Geopolitics Podcast. I'm your host, Ankit Panda, recording from Washington, D.C. I'm delighted to have Joseph Dempsey joining me today. Joe, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ankit. Good to be here.
So Joe is a research associate for defense and military analysis at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. He's one of the foremost open source analysts working on conventional, nuclear, and all things military hardware. And the reason I'm actually particularly delighted to have Joe on today is to talk about developments in the past 6 weeks or so on the Korean Peninsula. And when I say Korean Peninsula, I am talking about both Koreas. So as perhaps many of our listeners are aware, there has been a lot of military activity in both Koreas recently. In September 2021, North Korea carried out 4 different missile tests over 4 weeks. And at least in my recollection, I can't recall a more qualitatively diverse month of missile testing in North Korean history than what we witnessed in September 2021. So we'll talk a little bit about the developments we saw in North Korea. But that very same month in South Korea, we saw the introduction of a whole range of new capabilities. Some of these systems had been tested earlier and were simply publicized by the South Korean government in September 2021. But in broad strokes, we have important developments relevant to the military balance on the Korean Peninsula in both Koreas. And Joe and I will hopefully take you through the significance of some of these developments more broadly. But Joe, before we dig in to this question of whether there is an arms race on the Korean Peninsula and what are the factors driving this arms race, let me just very quickly do a little bit of a scene setter for our listeners. And I apologize in advance because this is going to be a lot because there was a lot tested. But just to kind of set the mood for today's discussion, here's what we're going to talk about. So in September 2021, on the North Korean side, we have a new long-range cruise missile, apparently nuclear capable, a new rail mobile basing mode for short-range ballistic missiles, a new hypersonic boost-clad vehicle, or a claimed hypersonic boost-clad vehicle introduced, and a new surface-to-air missile system tested. And as a bonus, North Korea did also host a remarkable defense exhibition in early October where they basically celebrated the entirety of their missile arsenal, really focusing on developments over the last 5 years mostly. And then turning to the South Korean side, in September 2021, these were some of the capabilities that were either tested or publicized. The first was the Hyunmoo-4 short-range ballistic missile, a ballistic missile with a heavy 2-ton conventional payload that manifested as a result of the 2017 modification by the Trump administration to the U.S.-South Korea missile guidelines, which had previously restricted the payload weights that South Korea could assign to its conventional missiles. The Hyunmoo 4-4 submarine-launched ballistic missile was tested for the first time, making South Korea the first country to operate a conventionally armed submarine-launched ballistic missile. That's a very interesting development, so we'll get into that a bit. South Korea also showed off a supersonic cruise missile with an apparent ramjet. A solid-fuel satellite launch vehicle motor test was also carried out, and a new air-to-ground missile was also demonstrated off of KF-15 fighters. So, Joe, there's a lot to talk about here, but why don't we begin, I guess, with the higher-level question here before we dig into some of these systems. There's been a lot of talk that there's an arms race underway in the Korean Peninsula. What's your take on that? Is there an arms race? What is motivating this arms race, if it exists?
Well, it's a good question, and certainly there's been a big amount of arms development on both sides of the border. Obviously, we see a lot of North Korean ambitions maturing, shall we say, certainly over the last 5 years that we've all been commenting quite a lot on. So it's no surprise we keep seeing new systems from there and new developments. Though even still there, there's always a sense that because of limited testing, a lot of these systems are not, so we say, fully formed, fully tested, and there's a big ambiguity about even the ones that we saw, for example, more on the 4 or 5 year mark, particularly those in 2017, if they ever will become operational, if they're ever fielded or not. So just rather than kind of concentrating on those, seemingly, what we do see is them kind of being more ambitious and diversifying and modernizing even before necessarily some of the older systems are fielded. So that's an interesting question about where they are there and how much is actually substantiated, I guess, in terms of what they can deploy. On the South Korean side, obviously we're seeing, a lot of new ambitions come through. We're seeing a lot of the indigenous defense industries, which have grown a lot, particularly over the last decade or so, coming to form. Obviously, they're more active on the export market increasingly, so it's not necessarily all for domestic consumption. And whilst a lot of it is justified publicly, because of the increased threat from North Korea, in which case that is an arms buildup, of course. Not all of it is specifically aimed at North Korea, clearly, particularly some of the systems they've shown recently has kind of more regional implications.
Right. So, let's just kind of frame the policy frameworks for both of these arms buildups, which I think is important for people to appreciate. So, my interpretation, at least, is that we have basically 2 5-year periods of military modernization ongoing on the Korean Peninsula, and it's rather a neat kind of parallel, even if the timelines don't exactly line up. So last year, the South Korean National Assembly assented to a $250 billion roughly spending plan over 5 years, known as the Intermediate Term National Defense Plan. This included a lot of the things that have been tested recently, including the new submarine-launched ballistic missile, for instance, plans for aircraft carriers, nuclear propulsion submarines, and so forth down the line. And then on the North Korean side, we began 2021 with the 8th Party Congress of the Workers' Party of Korea, a really important apex event for the ruling Workers' Party in the country. And Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, very clearly, and really I think in an unprecedented kind of work report, very specifically laid out the kinds of things that he wanted to see developed in this coming period. And lo and behold, many of those capabilities that he mentioned in that report were tested in September 2021. I think with the exception of the rail mobile missile, which was not explicitly mentioned in that report, everything else was something that Kim Jong-un had outlined aspirations for. So both Koreas, I think, are pushing ahead with these plans. So Joe, I mean, now, sort of digging in a little bit into these capabilities themselves, I think you've injected a necessary dose of reality into at least the North Korean side here, which is that we've seen a remarkable diversity of North Korean testing and platforms, basing modes even now with rail mobility. Of the new systems tested, which seems the most significant to you and the most likely to meaningfully alter the military balance on or around the Korean Peninsula in the coming years?
Good question. Yeah, I think all the 4 systems we've seen tested in September, there are caveats to apply to those. So it depends, about how capable they actually are, where they are in terms of development, and what they do. I think, to be honest, the cruise missile one is probably the most significant, I would say, because it is probably the biggest diversification, I guess, from their traditional ballistic missile systems. Obviously, there's caveats that apply to cruise missile because, yes, it can. Well, if we take North Korea's claim, as given, it can fly 1,500 kilometers. Now, obviously, but we should be careful assigning capabilities assigned to more contemporary cruise missiles, particularly in terms of how low is it able to fly to the ground.
Well, before we get into that, do you mind just laying out the differences between cruise and ballistic missiles and why North Korea might want a cruise missile?
Sure, of course. So ballistic missiles obviously kind of follow a ballistic trajectory, kind of go up high and then go down. Typically, obviously, there are some caveats around that with quasi-ballistic missiles, which North Korea has also developed, of course. Whereas cruise missiles, can be launched, they're slower, but they do fly typically or associated with, low flying, potentially easier to avoid any defenses because they can be pre-programmed run flight routes to make it difficult to detect and engage. They also have the ability to go, circumvent routes as well, which ballistics don't. They are more of a traditional straight line. So it kind of opens up some opportunities, particularly against South Korean investment in anti-missile defense systems, which are, when I say anti-missile defenses, I'm talking ABM, anti-ballistic missile defense specifically. Although, of course, they will have some cruise missile, anti-cruise missile capabilities inherently. But it just makes it a more diverse delivery system or delivery system options, which pose challenges, as do a lot of the other systems, to South Korean planners.
Right. And, cruise missiles aren't new for North Korea, right? I mean, they operated Soviet origin KH-35 cruise missiles for some years. But I think what's notable here, Joe, as you reminded us, is the order of magnitude improvement on range, at least claimed. 1,500 kilometers brings North Korea's new cruise missile into the same league as the Tomahawk, the Caliber, some of the longer range systems out there. And of course, the North Korean claim that this is a, quote, strategic weapon. And for listeners, strategic is a euphemism that North Korea tends to use when it wants the outside world to appreciate that a certain system is nuclear capable. And there are questions there, of course, with whether, North Korea has made great strides with making its nuclear warheads more compact, but just spatially and in terms of weight and center of gravity issues, there are different challenges associated with developing a nuclear warhead for a cruise missile. So I think the jury's still out on that. No, but Joe, I thought that was a great explanation of why the North Koreans might look to a cruise missile, and I think that goes into one of the big themes that we've seen in North Korean weapons development and testing. Really going back to 2019 and the period after the Hanoi summit, which is that many of the new North Korean systems that have been tested have a very big focus on stressing and defeating existing missile defenses in South Korea. So the North Koreans are developing an array of systems that create an array of planning challenges for the missile defense mission in South Korea. With cruise missiles in particular, I think the most important thing, and you highlighted this, is the ability for cruise missiles effectively to function like aircraft and come to South Korean targets from angles of attack that would simply not be possible with ground-based ballistic missiles, which would just have to travel north to south. A cruise missile could fly out into the Sea of Japan, turn around, and approach South Korea from, let's say, the east. Of course, a lot depends on the kind of seeker and guidance technology that the North Koreans have, which I think is difficult to assess at this point, given the data that we have. Can we talk a little bit about the rail mobile missile launch? Because I thought this was fascinating. Tell us a little bit about why they might rail.
Well, just kind of touch on something you said first, though. Yeah. I think the term strategic, it has traditionally been used with, say, what we assume is nuclear capable. I kind of wonder the fact that it's applied to cruise missiles such big range that they may also partially implying the range. So there's some caveats applying to that, or a note of caution. And obviously, another thing that was mentioned at the Party Congress was, of course, the development of tactical nuclear weapons. So, put those two things together that have appeared. It also opens a whole new range of potentially, if they are able to miniaturize warheads to that degree, it opens up the dual capability possibility of a lot of other different systems that we've seen as well.
Right. No, those are both great additions. Yeah.
Yeah. Just on the rail-based SRBM. So we generally assume that the missile itself is a KN-23, which we saw first shown in 2019. So it's a short-range ballistic missile. It looks like the Russian Iskander system. And I say looks like because obviously there's some caveats to play over where the origins are, and we don't quite know that, of course. But it has similar capabilities in terms of its short-range, solid-propelled missile. It performs kind of a quasi-ballistic trajectory, which means that, in the case of the KN-23, it does like a pull-up maneuver near the end to, not just extend range, but also it's not a typical trajectory, which also makes it kind of hard to track and engage. It gives new challenges. Not impossible, but it gives a more challenging engagement environment. The rail side of things, well, it's the first time we've actually seen a rail mobile system. Historically, all North Korea's ground-based systems have been road mobile, and that's been obviously an important part of it. They never really went the silo route. It's always been road mobile. They certainly had some problems doing large road mobile systems, and that's still an area of ambiguity. Although there was some reports that, historically that North Korea was looking towards rail, this is the first time we've seen it. And it's interesting about why they've done this and how they've done it so far. And they've indicated that this unit size is going to grow over time. Right. So this is something that's not just a test. It seems that they are going to move forward with this in one form or another. For rail, it's interesting. So they showed it very much in a converted boxcar, which I believe is of Chinese origin. It's just converted civilian boxcar, and they can fit it all in apparently. So that element of concealment is quite key because it probably won't look as obvious as a TEL moving around on the road. The fact it's rail mobile means it can be moved around fairly quickly across the country because they have a very well-established rail network that is more than likely a much better condition than their road system. And obviously they can also control the rail more than the road potentially. Mm-hmm. There's plenty of tunnels they can hide it in, of course. It's not as mobile as a road system, of course, but it's kind of like there's different payoffs depending which way you go. The curious thing about this system is, at least while they've started it, is why they're using it for a short-range system.
I agree. Yep.
When we look at other countries who've gone the rail mobile route, certainly Russia historically, India currently with one of their systems. They focus more on the large strategic systems. And, when you look at it for what North Korea has challenges in developing road mobile TELs, of the ICBM kind of category. Again, there's some ambiguity around that still, but it would make sense to do mount the ICBMs on rail mobile. However, it's not necessarily suited for what the current generation of North Korean ICBMs, which are still liquid fueled. And that poses new challenges because you still have to carry around fuel trucks, which obviously could be rail mounted, but the concealment element gets a lot less impactful when you're starting to do big convoys of, a huge TEL trailer,
Right.
which is going to be massive anyway, plus fuel tanks associated with it and lots of other systems. So the concealment element goes, as is the element of pre-fueling. Also, when you look at the large cradles they have to do for road mobile missiles, for the ICBMs, they're huge in terms of the hydraulics and stuff. So actually be able to fit that into a boxcar, there's new challenges. So I think, long term, we might see more solid fuel based systems for North Korea. But I think obviously until they get to where they want to be with a solid fueled ICBM, we're not going to see that kind of categorization yet.
Right. Well, so, I would have agreed entirely with everything you just said on the limitations with liquid propellant systems. But here, I think we should transition a little bit to talk about the Hwasong 8 glider.
Yes.
There's a lot to talk about there. I mean, a lot of people focused on the pointy end of that missile because hypersonic things are exciting and very much in vogue internationally. And I think that's part of the reason North Korea is actually pursuing these weapons. But what was interesting, and this is going to get a little bit in the weeds, and I apologize to listeners, is the North Korean claim of introducing, and this is a bit of jargon from Soviet missile history, not really relevant, but ampulization to their liquid propellant missiles. And that's an interesting and significant development if it means what I think it means, which is that they are experimenting with storable propellants for long-term operation, which means that one of those limitations that we'd long sort of pointed out about liquid propellant missiles, which is that, they need fuel trucks and oxidizer trucks, which generate huge satellite signatures, may be modified in the future. And that also opens up possibilities not only for rail mobility, but also for canisterizing longer range liquid propellant missiles, right? But let's not get too far into the into the weeds on that, because it is a very kind of ambiguous issue because we don't exactly know what the North Koreans mean for the moment. But before we move on to South Korea, I do want to talk about the glider a little bit. So my interpretation of this test, which the South Koreans released some data on, is that it wasn't fully successful. And the statement from the North Korean Academy of Defense Science, I think, was pretty moderate in the language used to talk about the glider. They actually focused a lot more on the fuel and the ampulization than they did on the flight success of the glider itself. But what's your take on this hypersonic system? Is this a technology demonstrator? Is this going to be a niche capability, or is this something you might expect the North Koreans to continue testing and refining?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of questions. I think there's more questions than answers, unfortunately, on this point, on what a Hwasong 8 is and what it demonstrated and what it will demonstrate. I think just touching on the ambulization side of things a little bit, it is interesting, and it could be one question I have is how long have they developed this system? Because the name Hwasong 8, we don't know if it applies, by the way, to the booster, the glide vehicle, or both. Assuming it applies to maybe the booster section, which could be based on the Hwasong 12 IRBM, because it's 8 is a number we've long missed in the Hwasong series and haven't been able to assign, and we're now up to 17. So this system could have been going on for a while, and this could have been an alternative route they looked at to address the historic weaknesses of the liquid fuel missiles. And the fact they're returning to it, could be related to they may still be having some problems developing the longer range solids. So it's interesting to see where they go with this, but I think it may have might be more history behind that than we know. Mm-hmm. Touching on the HGV, hypersonic glide vehicle, what they claim to be a hypersonic glide vehicle. I mean, it's probably one of the most ambitious things they've done. And not that I dismiss North Korean ambition, because that would be foolish over the last 5 years to do so. But massive caveat supply. Hypersonic glide vehicles have been around a lot. They are literally hyped, very much so, particularly Russian and Chinese and US in developments of that. But they are hard things to do properly and make capable. And, for example, we don't even know that North Korea has the on-ground facilities to test these systems, particularly a hypersonic wind tunnel. So what they are doing and what they showed us, it's very much debatable. The test is very ambiguous as well, because it only went, from the South Korean estimates of what they did release, we're talking 200-kilometer range, so very short range. And we're talking, and I think mixed reports is either 60 kilometers or 30-kilometer apogee.
Right.
Either way, it's a very shallow test at very short range. What that picked up upon, whether that's just the booster, whether it's whether that figure encapsulates the glide vehicle separation or a failure, is very much unknown. And it's also very much unclear what the parameters of the test were meant to be from North Korea. Because, if you're doing an initial test of a hypersonic glide vehicle and booster, a short range test might make sense the first time to test separation. But North Korea don't test often, so they tend not to do half measures.
Right. And I mean, with the hypersonic system too. So I mean, just for listeners, by the way, the way a hypersonic glider works is very much like a ballistic missile. The booster will carry the glider to high altitudes outside the Earth's atmosphere. The glider will separate, descend, re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, and then begin aerodynamically gliding to its target, spending most of its flight time in unpowered gliding flight, unlike a ballistic missile, which would spend most of that time outside the Earth's atmosphere. But what that means for North Korea is that, unlike their older practice of using so-called lofted trajectories, where they would launch ballistic re-entry vehicles on incredibly sharp angles to shorten their range to avoid overflying Japan, most of the time. I mean, they did overfly Japan a few times with full-range tests. They simply can't do that with a hypersonic glider if they want to get any kind of useful data. They would have to fly it to, if not full range, to a much longer range than an equivalent ballistic reentry vehicle. So that's a challenge. And, I mean, Joe, I think I agree with your measured skepticism, and I also agree with your general principle about not underestimating the North Koreans. My interpretation of this test is that it was mostly about the booster, because I do think that they consider the introduction of this ampulization technology to be significant. The glider is a way to, I think, get attention. I'm sure, Park Jong-cheong or any of these, defense scientists in North Korea probably convinced Kim Jong-un that he needs a hypersonic glider to cope with missile defenses. Spoiler alert, he doesn't actually need a hypersonic glider to cope with missile defenses. There are lots of ways for North Korea to stress missile defenses in the United States and South Korea and Japan. They have the existing capabilities to do this. But it is an ambitious, technology program. I mean, just to compare, in China, before China's first glider system, the DF-17, began operational testing, there were scores of hypersonic wind tunnel tests, scores of other tests just to rate the glider's aerodynamic performance before they ever started testing it on a ballistic missile. So North Korea, I think it's fair to say that North Korea is probably the first country to have tested a hypersonic glider off the bat on a booster like this, because other countries have done this, with a significant lead period on R&D on ground-based facilities. But anyways, we are sort of running out of time, so I do want to move on a little bit to talk a bit about South Korea. I talked a little bit about the capabilities that the South Koreans have been introducing in the last few weeks. The Hyunmoo-4 heavy payload precision short-range ballistic missile, the first conventional submarine-launched ballistic missile, the new supersonic cruise missile. Tell us a little bit about the doctrinal needs for these kinds of system in South Korea. Here I'm kind of leading you towards talking a bit about overwhelming response or Korea massive punishment and retaliation. These things are really how the South Koreans justify their pursuit of many of these systems. Can you sort of break down for our listeners, what those are?
Yes, of course. So one of the kind of key doctrines of South Korea's responses to North Korean missiles and potential North Korean missile strike on them, actually it fits into two, I would say. So one is the overwhelming response, so that if they are attacked, they can retaliate massively, and they can, they will take out military facilities, but also the leadership. So, having almost like a second strike capability, albeit a conventional one. So we're talking about, mobile systems, particularly the SLBM side of things, because obviously it's a lot harder to target a submarine-based system. But also, I think, in fairness, a lot of the stuff that they've demonstrated recently also fits into the kind of the preemptive strike area, which is almost their first aspect, where they wish to be able to respond very quickly to an impending strike. You have both intelligence assets to identify it, but then to strike it quickly. So you've also got, other systems which are harder to target. So they've got, development of a new air-launched cruise missile, for example. The SLBM could also be used in that sense as well. The SLBM also could be used as a preemptive strike, and it has some advantages, particularly about, because they can already, before we knew this was an official program, because I should just point out that until we actually had this acknowledgement last month that they'd done it, South Korea had never officially acknowledged an SLBM program or an SSB, so the boat carrying it program. They never acknowledged that at all. We kind of knew, but it's interesting that the first notice we had is essentially when they had an operational boat, albeit maybe not quite an operational missile to mount on it. So one of the advantages of using SLBM over cruise missiles, even submarine-based, is that it might be able to target something quicker because it travels a lot quicker, essentially. Mm-hmm. And, those vital minutes are very important when you're looking launch a preemptive strike.
Right. And so, when we look at the balance of developments on the South Korean side, a lot of this, I think, is also taking place in a context where South Korea, at least for South Korean progressives, there is a pursuit here of added so-called missile sovereignty. That was a big feature of President Moon's summit with President Biden earlier this year, when the USROK revised missile guidelines, which had prescribed South Korea's range and payload, payload before 2017, were formally scrapped. So there's no more limitations on South Korea, apart from its obligations on non-binding non-proliferation requirements like the MTCR and so forth. And apart from that, there is also South Korea is pursuing many of these capabilities to also facilitate wartime operational control transfer, which is also an important issue, particularly. It's an important issue for conservatives and progressives alike in South Korea. So just that added political context, I think, is worthwhile. The conventional SLBM, has raised eyebrows, understandably, about potential nuclear hedging by South Korea, because, as you pointed out, this is an unusual. It's an unusual strategy, given South Korea's strategic predicament. South Korea is in the odd position and the unenviable position of trying to deter a nuclear-armed North Korea while remaining a non-nuclear weapon state. So South Korea is not pursuing nuclear weapons today, but it is, one of the trends in South Korean missile development is this very strong emphasis on heavy conventional payloads. And in the South Korean press, you'll often see a comparison that many of these new missiles are similar to tactical nuclear weapons, which is a ridiculous claim because we're very far off from tactical nuclear weapon yields with these conventional systems. But it is worth highlighting that, what you said about assuring retaliation, the South Koreans are very much seeking to do that with a range of increasingly more survivable platforms. But, Joe, just to close out today's discussion, I think we've gone through this wide range of developments, and this is all, again, just over the last 6 weeks, so just a remarkable period on the Korean Peninsula. When it comes to sort of stemming this arms race, where can we even begin? Where can the two Koreas even begin to go with risk reduction, threat reduction, or is this arms race going to continue for the next few years? What's your assessment?
Good question, Ankit. I hope they won't continue at the same pace it has done for the last 6 weeks, because that's too unsustainable just for me and you, at the very least. Yeah, it's a tricky one. So, South Korea is more sustainable and it's more credible in what they're showing, and can be taken as a given, but it also raises, as you kind of touched upon, wider concerns about what the end game is and where this comes the precedence it sets. Because some of the systems they developed, could follow on to other areas. So, for example, there's always a discussion that of nuclear submarines for South Korea, and particularly in light of the Australian deal, that's going to raise questions about cooperation with South Korea, particularly for America. The taking out the missile range and payload limitations, obviously it does impact North Korea, but also it raises concerns beyond there, because when you're talking about missiles with capabilities over 1,000 kilometers, yes, you can hit North Korea from anywhere within South Korea, but you can also target major capitals of Tokyo and Beijing. That also falls in range. And even some of the systems they've showed, example, the supersonic supersonic anti-ship missile was another system that they showed. In my mind, there's very little need for that against North Korea, who have very few principal surface combatants. So, right. Decent sized warships that you'd actually justify the missile, with no defenses really against even a subsonic missile. So it does raise some questions about, not all of these systems are inherently counter North Korea.
Right.
The North Korean side of things is less credible, I think, because we're not going to see all these systems fully developed. If they and we might see some, as you say, is the hypersonic glide vehicle a real thing? And we've seen the diversification, then probably settle on a couple of systems to fully develop. But when you look at what's happened in the last 5 years, we've seen systems that have fallen out of favor or didn't work, and they've moved on. But they're still showing us that pathway. I think obviously by showing all these diverse systems, it gives them more options to talk and negotiate about what they are willing to give up if they come back to the table.
Right. I think, I think for the North Koreans, leverage at the diplomatic table is always part of the story. I think that's one of the lessons Kim Jong-un might have taken away from the 2018, 2019 experience, which is that despite initial perceptions, the capabilities they demonstrated by the end of 2017 simply weren't sufficient to bring the United States to concede the things that the North Koreans wanted. So I think, that is a big part of what's happening here. But Joe, I suspect, before long we will have more to talk about on the Korean Peninsula missile front. But I do want to thank you so much for coming on today and sharing your insights. I always learn a lot from your work, so this was good to have you on. I can't believe I haven't had you on the show before. But thanks a lot for taking the time today.
No, you're very welcome. It's been a pleasure to be on. Thank you.